ask the right question to those data sets with those data sets?
Yeah, so I'd say it's you know, about now is a good time to start looking for a data set and start thinking about what your research question will be. Um, so it doesn't necessarily have to be one before the other. I mean, you can kind of look at the different data sets, and then from that data set, once you understand it, then you can kind of come up with your research question. I think that's the way I would do it.
Okay.
Um, So you're more than welcome to use any of the data sets that we provide for you. It might be actually one of the easiest options is just using one of the data sets that we've already used throughout the course. And you can find those again on the Files tab. If you just click on Files, they have the data sets organized by the different weeks. And there should also be some information on the data set as well that you can access. So here are all the, so, just to give you an example, this was the Titanic data set. So, in previous iterations of the course, a lot of students like this data set. They do a lot of analysis on it and come up with some interesting findings about the Titanic. And from a historical perspective, a sociological perspective, it's an interesting case. Or, if you look here, there should be some additional information on how the data set was. So for each of them, there's also usually a supplemental file that gives some more information on the context of the data set as well. So you're more than welcome to use any of these. Some of the students they have a specific research question they want to look at, so they're going outside the course and they're looking from their own data sets. So we gave some resources on how to find your own data set. You could find that on the discussion forum. If you just go here to discussions. There's a pinned discussion up here about the final project data sets. And there's another one about questions or concerns or thoughts on the final project. So it's a nice place just to get feedback from both the instructors and also your fellow students. So a great resource is the Dataverse, which has a lot of data sets from studies conducted at Harvard. So you just have to log in with your credentials, and there's some other resources that we've included here in order to find your own data set. And just looking at where we are in the class, today is the 18th. So tomorrow we'll be talking about tests for contingency tables. That will be the next module. And that will cover, we'll be learning about ANOVA and the chi-square test. And after that, we'll be learning about inferences for correlation and regression. So we've already covered correlation regression. This is how to run a hypothesis test for those. And then finally, there'll be a course review, and the final project will be due, and then you'll have your final exam 1 week later. So we're pretty much at the tail end of the course, and so after tomorrow, you'll pretty much be pretty prepared to have all the tools you need to complete the final project.
Justin, I actually booked the whole day for tomorrow to actually start the project. I've been looking at a couple of data sets. Last Friday, I spent a couple of hours just looking at different data sets. What would be your recommendation? Like usually, I mean, for any project, like in my daily basis, usually the hardest thing is to start, like to get a point, like to actually start running some analysis. What will be like the most frequent analysis that you do when you open a data set? Like, what will be your, I don't know, most common questions to just to kind of like understand the data set, and then
Yeah. So kind of like just how we've been kind of looking at the data sets throughout the course. So the first thing that we kind of taught you was just kind of viewing the data set within R, for instance, or just viewing it in general, and describing what the different variables that you have in your data set. Are you dealing with categorical variables, quantitative variables, and just grouping them in different ways, and just taking a look at what information the data is offering you, and what it's telling you. So just so you can understand, because frequently, what a statistician's job is you have all this information and usually have more information than you need. It's really the statistician's job to decide which data is interesting and to come up with an interesting question that you can use that data set to help answer. So I'd say first step is just looking at the variables and looking at your data set, trying to see how big it is, and understanding the methodology from how they came up with writing out that data set. And then second, what you can then start to do is you can then start to visualize the data. So we described in the beginning of the semester, if you remembered, we talked about how to visualize data the best way, depending on what data you're looking at. You can make a histogram, you can make a scatter plot with different, if you have two variables and you want to see if there's a trend, you could create a scatter plot between those two variables, and you can make then some observations based on the visualization of that data set. So say you were looking at a given an example data set and you want to know if the data is normally distributed. So you can make a histogram of the variable and then just take a look at the distribution. And then you can start talking about, like what we learned in module 3, we can describe the center of that distribution, either using the mean or the median, depending on if the data is skewed or not. And then you could also describe the spread of that data. So you can use the standard deviation, or you could take a look at a box and whisker plot to see if there's any outliers. So these are all kind of questions that, will help guide your analysis. And then depending on what your research question would then dictate what the next step from there would be. So you can run a number of different tests. You can run a test for means, a test for proportions. You can run a test for contingency tables. You can look at linear regression, and you can use some of those linear regression skills that we've learned. So depending on what your research question is, that will then drive what kind of test you'll be looking at. So I'd say, and the whole point of this exercise is really to, with the research question, it's designed to be able to add something new to the conversation. So it's in academia, what we'll do is we'll look at what was already said on a given subject and try to impart a new viewpoint, or to try to add more information to the subject. So, the idea is not really to reiterate what's already out there, but also to add to the conversation, to come up with maybe a new observation. So yeah, I'd say, if your plan is to come up with your own research question and your own data set, I'd say first try to figure out what you're interested in. Next, you can go and take a look at some of those links to try to see what kind of data sets are available. And then once you found your data set, then you can pull it up and you can look at it and then start to think about what can you say with this information, what kind of tests can you run, and then what can you say about it. So, your paper, you might have an introduction, you'll have your analysis, and you can provide, figures from your analysis, and then, finally, you're going to have a conclusion. So, I'd say kind of the structure of the paper is you can have like an introduction, you can have your analysis where you show the results of your analysis, and then you can have a discussion section and a conclusion. So I think we provide you with a sample.
Yeah. I saw there were like 5 different samples in the files.
Great.
Yeah, if you go into files, there's the third option. I think there are like 5 different samples for graduates.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I went through all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so we could take a look. So here we have the guidelines. So it's, I think students might think that, 10 pages, it sounds like a lot, but it's really not that, long, because you have to understand it's double spaced, you're including tables and graphs. So really it's not really that long of a paper at all. So I'd say, I think the key here is really, to make sure that, I think what really helps here is it's not really a question of length, it's more quality. It's about trying to come up with an interesting research question, running an analysis, and, making sure that your analysis is sound and it's statistically correct, and being able to describe, a coherent conclusion from the analysis that you ran. I think that's pretty much what I'm looking for when I grade the papers is, overall and on its own, how does it, I look at making sure that the analysis was correct and it supports the research question and the conclusion, and that it on its own, and as a whole, it's coherent and it makes sense, and how well it reads. I mean, that's pretty much what statisticians do, and especially amongst, in the academic field, no matter what field you're working on, you're most likely going to have some statistics, and that's what, for publications, that's what peer reviewers are looking for. They're looking at the methodology of how you came up with your analysis, and also they're looking at, does this data on its own support the conclusion? So yeah, so it says here, you're basically going to be conducting 1 or 2 statistical analyses. So you might be looking at a t-test for the difference of 2 means, along with a bar graph, and it should be appropriate for your question. And you'll have different sections. You'll have your abstract, which will be a very brief summary of the methods and the results. So abstracts are frequently used in academic writing. So any publication, you'll have an abstract. It's kind of like the front cover of a book. It's kind of like a short paragraph, which tells you quickly what you did and what you found from what you did. Then you'll have an introduction, which will set up kind of the background to what you're working on, and what your goals are, what your research question was. Your data and method section, so you'll be talking about the source for your data, so where you found your data set, how the methodology of how they came up with that data set, and also the method section, so how you actually went about finding the results of your analysis. And then you'll have a results section, so this will include your results from your analysis, so the data with your figures, your graphs, or your tables, and will explain briefly the significance of the results. And then finally, the conclusion. This is the lengthy section where you're really going to be telling the reader what the significance is of the results that you found, and just summarizing the analysis you did as a whole, and why it matters and how it adds to the conversation. And we actually provide the grading rubric here. So this is what will be using to assign grades to the paper. And this is a rough rubric. I'd say that it gives you the idea of what we're looking for from an A to a B to a C or D. But as far as a 90 versus a 95 or 100, that's going to be a little bit more fine-tuned and kind of just taking the paper in as a whole and how it reads. But I'd say overall students do fairly very well on the final projects. I think exactly what you were saying. I think maybe sometimes one of the hardest part is taking a subject and taking a question and really getting started. And I'd say once you get over that and you start running your analysis, it's fairly straightforward. Another thing is I think a lot of students might be ambitious. Like the course has a lot of students who have a lot of different interests and questions and project ideas. I think another thing just to consider is that it's a short assignment. It's not going to be a lengthy review, and it's not going to have, I've had students who ask me if they can create their own data set. You could. However, I'd say it's kind of outside the scope of this assignment. This assignment's really just designed to really just show that you really got a grasp of what was taught this semester as far as learning all the statistical tools and being able to apply them by running your own analysis and coming up with a conclusion based on a research question, because this is basically what academics do, and what the goal is of the course is for you to be able to be comfortably able to run your own analysis and be capable of coming up with a publication, something that would be be submitted for peer review, and something that would pass the peer review process.
Perfect.
So hopefully that answers some of the questions you had. Did you have any more questions, Diego? I'm happy to.
Like I said, I booked the whole day for tomorrow to start working. I have a couple of data sets that I'm actually been looking at, including the ones that you guys provided. But tomorrow, hopefully, I will define the data sets and the question, and then I'm pretty sure we'll have some questions after that.
Yeah, and the I'd say these samples are definitely good representations. Like we actually provided a data set on different body measurements, if you remember. So this sample paper looks at BMI and whether it's an accurate predictor of body fat. So it's definitely an interesting research question, and it uses one of the data sets that we provided, and it's so if you see here that what this student did was that they did a linear regression. So they present the BMI versus the body fat. These are two different variables from the data set, and they made a scatter plot and ran a linear regression model and plotted the line of best fit here. So as we can see here, there's a positive linear relationship here, because as the BMI is increasing, the body fat is also increasing. So we can see there's definitely a trend here. And then the student presented the results of that regression model output and ran a correlation coefficient hypothesis test. So this correlation coefficient hypothesis test, this is covered in the last lecture. So we didn't cover this test just yet. And then there was a conclusion from that. So this is 7 pages, double spaced. So as you can see, it's nothing too difficult. It's actually fairly short. This is for the graduate paper. This is an interesting paper. This is looking at alumni of Harvard College, looking at giving and donation. So this is not a data set that we provided. The student actually found this data set from the Harvard Alumni Affairs and Development System. So I'm not sure if this particular student was a student who worked in that department. It's definitely possible, or if that data set is available publicly. But an interesting question. The student used made a probability table, and this used probability. So drawing on the probability module, they looked at the probability of whether a student is more likely to give as a donor, and looking at different factors that affect donating. And here's a scatter plot looking at correlation and covariance as some of the linear regression, making a conclusion here. This is 10 pages. So this is another interesting question. So it's, I always find it very interesting because, the data sets that we provide for the course, there's so many different questions that you can come up with. So this student looked at the employed ACS data set, and they looked at gender differences in working hours to see whether men work longer hours than women. And that was the question here. And it's really interesting just to see, with the data sets, there's so many different questions you could come up with. Like even just the Titanic data set alone, the first data set, I've seen so many different research questions from there, looking at the different variables of age and gender and class and there's a lot of data, so you can come up with a number of different questions even just with that one data set. So this should give you a pretty good idea of what we're looking for. This paper's on poverty status and depression. Fatima, did you have any questions as well? So this was looking at, we actually used this data set in one of the problem sets. If you remember one of the missions, we looked at poverty status and whether someone was considered to be depressed or not, and looking at the different probabilities of the exposure to poverty and being depressed. So this is the example we used when we were teaching the relative risk concept and the formula for that. And then the student used a Pearson's chi-square test. So this we're releasing the material for this tomorrow. So you'll be learning about the chi-square test in tomorrow's module. This is just a figure from the chi-square test. So it's a good example to both use all the stats that you've learned and also to be able to play around with one of the statistical packages. So like R, for instance, you can use any statistical package. So if you prefer to use Excel, you're more than welcome to use whatever you prefer to use. I mean, just because we've been teaching you R, a lot of students choose to use R to use some of the application of what we've learned this semester.
Yeah, I was able to link R to Tableau, so I think I'm going to be using that.
That's great.
Pretty cool to use the functions from R in Tableau. It's actually is very helpful for my work, for my job actually.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Tableau is a great software, and if you have access to that, that's definitely that'll definitely be very nice. I think Harvard provides a license for Tableau, if I'm not mistaken, or they have a student license available. So,
Yeah,
but
it's free for students actually.
mhm. Yeah. So, but it's nice to take advantage of that because you know, if you don't have access to that license, it's a costly software to purchase. So it's nice to have that available through Harvard or through the student um, license key. That's what's nice about R as well, is that it's open source. So they don't charge for it as compared to, let's say, Stata, which is another statistical package that's used quite often. That actually that there's a charge for Stata, and that's a costly statistical program. So yeah, so I'm happy to go over. We have about a half hour remaining. Happy to go over any of the material from the lectures. That if you have any questions on that, happy to answer any questions on that, or lecture on the material, or if anyone has any questions on the final paper, or anything in general. I'm happy to you know, depending on what you guys find most helpful, I'm happy to help out in any way I can.
Hi, Justin. This is Abu. My first time joining.
Hi, Abu. Welcome.
Thank you. I happen to be in the East Coast. I'm in New York right now, so managed to join. Normally, the time difference is too bad that I can't join, but I thought I'll try and make it today.
Well, thanks for stopping by, and welcome to the East Coast. It was a nice day today, so
yep,
you enjoyed the weather.
Thank you.
So, Abu, do you have any questions I can help answer, either related to the project or anything in the class?
Yeah, I think it's more the project, and I may be behind on some of the notes, but I think there was something on past projects, right? Mm-hmm. That we can get an idea of what people have done in the past. So, okay.
Yeah, exactly. So if you just go on the course website under Files, there's a folder here called Final Paper Documents, and under the Final Paper Documents, it will give both the guidelines, and it will also give some example papers, both for undergraduates and for graduates both. So we were just looking through some of the oh, sorry about that. Somehow